Thanks to everyone and apologies for my tardiness. I'm glad that I heard the bit that I did at the last presentation because I think it is a nice bridge into and closely related to what I'm going to share with you. So what I'd like to do is just to share my screen, and I have about a 20-minute presentation. It may be longer or shorter than that. My tendency is always to want to stop and talk in the midst of it. But I think for today, it would probably be better if I just move through the presentation and then pause for conversation. So please do feel free to write your comments or chat them or whatever would be helpful. So some of you know that my background and my life's work is in complex adaptive systems. And it becomes my process of understanding and seeing patterns in systems in all ways and times. And so when this question about the US strategy came up, it was a very rich opportunity, and I thank you for that. So I'm going to share with you some reflections about that. I'm going to talk about what patterns I think set conditions for failure in Afghanistan. And this is based on work that was done by the special investigators from the Congress, and there's a link that I'll give you to a report that they did in August of 21. The US congressional agency reviewed the failures in Afghanistan and shared them. And so I'm going to use that as a foundation for the place that I'm going to work from. I'm going to talk about what is the pattern within the pattern. So if we look at that, there's a list of 7 systemic failures. And as we look at them, what's a pattern that crosses them? And finally, what's possible if we take a new and different systemic lens on those issues and questions? So what are the 7 patterns? So this came from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And this is a link to that report. It's really quite lovely and helpful. The first challenge, they said, was strategy, that there was none, essentially, that it was inconsistent and unclear, that the purpose for the intervention changed over time, and at no point was it clear, bottom to top, what that purpose was. The second was timelines. One of the comments in the report is that the plan was more like 21-year plans than a 20-year plan. The third issue was sustainability, that they were focused on projects and completing projects beginning to end based on expectations, not progress of the shift of the system over time. The fourth issue was around people, that there was a very strong dismissive attitude of the people in the military, the NATO across the board, US of course, were dismissive of local intelligence. And so the history and the culture and the voices of local people, even the ones who were committed to the US effort, were dismissed in a way that really made the US forces blind and ignorant in ways that they shouldn't be. And connections. So the report said that the US was not aware of the connections between people, between institutions, between past and present and future. I think the connection with Pakistan is a perfect example that that connection was undervalued throughout. And so they missed the possibility for seeing unintended consequences from their actions because they saw things as separable, if not separated, and not interdependent. Context and culture. So we were preoccupied with technical solutions that were not fit for function in the time and place where they were. And this group in their report recognized that that was true and described it quite fully and comprehensively. Then monitoring and evaluation. So there was a tremendous amount of monitoring and evaluation throughout. There are more than 20 evaluation reports. per year through the whole process. So there are many, many opportunities for learning and change, but that discourse, that narrative was disconnected from reality. So these were the issues that they named as the ones that were core to the failure of the US effort at reconstruction in Afghanistan. And I suspect that all of these are embedded in your one ethic or the other ethic. Then as we look at these patterns that the experts have recognized, this is not the first time that these have been documented, then the question becomes, why doesn't it change? Why do we keep making these same mistakes over and over again? So what are the patterns that are within the patterns? Well, what I'd like to do is to think about it as an addiction to certainty and control that we in the West and in the North, particularly in the privileged West and North, particularly in the US, there's a way in which certainty and control has become the measure of value in our culture, in our economy, in our global relationships. So if we think about these 7 through that lens, we'll see that the strategy, we couldn't write a long-term strategy because no one could guarantee that it would be true. And we were so tied to being certain that we weren't willing to posit something that would be possible, but not guaranteed. In terms of timelines, with a 1-year timeline, you can see beginning to end, you can have some level of certainty, at least you can take action on the certainty that you do have. You can pretend or at least imagine yourself being in control. And so these 1-year plans became a way to imagine certainty and control in a space where that was not the case. And sustainability, no one wants to think about long-term accountability and sustainability if certainty and control are your values. In the long term, the one thing that you certainly give up is the predictability and control against which you can measure yourself in accountability. And so sustainability, long-term sustainability, became out of bounds for the considerations of the Americans in Afghanistan. And those of you who are historians see these patterns repeated, not just once, but many times, not just globally, but also domestically. This idea about certainty and control is based a great deal on homogeneity. This assumption, so fundamental. If you talk and think like me, then you must be right. And if you don't, then you must not be. And that I cannot or won't value that connection to be able to listen and to see difference. Solving problems, not shifting patterns. So in our perspective, we think about problems as things that have beginning and an end, best practice, clear measures, clear rules, solvable games to play. In complex systems, we think instead about shifting patterns. So what exists in this moment? What are the similarities and differences and tensions and possibilities in this moment? And how can we shift those through the connections that exist? So you're using the connections and the strength in the system in order to be able to transform it. And of course, context and culture. Consistency in a certainty and control world, consistency is accountability. Replicability is the way that things are measured. If you're in a high context, highly variable context and culture, as Afghanistan was, then that kind of consistency is not accountability, it is blindness. The consistency question was even larger here based on conversations we had with people who were in the US military and serving in Afghanistan. There was an incredible expectation that Afghanistan was going to be like Iraq. And so the strategy going into Afghanistan was based on the structure and culture that they had seen in Iraq. And you can hardly imagine 2 fundamental, ancient and traditional cultures that are as different as Iraq and Afghanistan are. But those differences were not recognized or accommodated. And finally, monitoring and evaluation. As you read those monitoring and evaluation reports, they're around managing the narrative. They're not about learning and shifting practice, assuming that that learning and shifting practice is clear. And so if you look at those 7 issues through this frame of certainty and control, then you can see how they are tied together, and that this challenge of certainty and control is driving those decisions that we continue to catch ourselves on. So what's the alternative? So the way that we think about systems is complex adaptive systems, and it is a systems view which is fundamentally unknowable and unpredictable. So uncertainty is the way of life in a complex adaptive system, but it's not a helpless way of life. It's not totally chaotic. There are patterns from which you can make reasoned, rational, constructive, ethical choices, in spite of the fact that you can't predict or control. So I'll introduce you to the complex adaptive system. It begins at the bottom with agents that are interacting in various ways. The agents can be individuals or units of government or neighborhoods or bombs and bullets, any kind of entities that are interacting with each other. And over time, as they interact, system-wide patterns emerge. And those patterns may be peace and justice. Those patterns may be productivity. They may be performance. They may be reputation. They may be strategy. But once the patterns begin to form, they then constrain the behavior of the agents in the future cycles. And so once the pattern begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. And so this is an idea that we've used in talking with people who work directly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US to say, what are the interactions historically that have generated the patterns, which are represented as performance within that context, and how does that self-reinforce so that the patterns that are generative and are generated are productive and learning, as opposed to controlling and constraining. And so this process has no beginning and no end, no predictability, no way to say exactly which agent and which relationship and what container is going to shift. It's even more complex than that, because each of the agents is itself a complex adaptive system. And each pattern that is systemic at one scale participates with other patterns to contribute to an even larger scaled pattern, so that this is, as we say, self-organizing all the way to the bottom. So one of the ways to think about the issue is that there was the 9/11 attack. At the same time, there's this military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower so wisely named, and which we have continued to amplify as a pattern. Then there's white supremacy, which is an underlying fundamental part of our American pattern. And then there were failing domestic policies, which forced the government to do something important. And at the same time, there were tax policies where during this time, taxes of the rich were decreased, and they were less responsible for paying for the war than the middle class was. And at the same time, we've got high-tech toys. So isn't it great if we can play with drones? Isn't that wonderful? That'll be really great. And artificial intelligence and all our great tech toys. We got a lot of things to learn and practice. And then there's the society and culture, the tensions of and histories of religious, ethical, faith-based, cultural biases of all kinds. And on top of that, you've got international development with its own distorting patterns that are in there, giving resources to the people who are most like them, who happen also to be exploiting native Afghanistan. And so in that combination, we have uncertainty on top of uncertainty on top of uncertainty, and drive for certainty on top of drive for certainty on top of drive for certainty. And so not only are we blinded, but we're blinded to the possibilities that will shine light on the questions and issues. And so if we think of the complex adaptive system as giving us a possibility to work beyond certainty and control, what does that look like? Well, patterns are emergent and systemic. These systems are open, they're high dimension, which means there are lots of variables that measure them, and they're nonlinear. So the causality is circular and not linear. And these are all behaviors that we get in complex adaptive systems of all kinds. You're probably familiar with them. They are all relevant as you look at the history of Afghanistan. You can see in each of the situations how all of these show up. One particularly that I want to focus on is precision without accuracy. That this assumption that we have that the way to get certainty and control is to be more and more and more precise. So this is an assumption of Western mathematics and science since Newton. The more precise, the smaller the unit of observation is, the more likely you'll get accurate response. So if you want to measure a table accurately, the smaller your unit of measure, the more likely you'll get an accurate measurement. And that's great in a homogeneous system. In a system that's highly diverse, the more precise you are, the less accuracy you get. And so when we see choice for an annual plan as building a kind of precision where there's control, what that does is to distort the vision, give you less accuracy of the idea of what's going to be ongoing. And we could look at each of these and its applications in Afghanistan. Happy to do that if you want to. But the question is, what is possible? If we are having to make strategy and take decisions, invest wealth and human life in peace and justice, then the question becomes, what is possible? And in these systems, there are 4 tools and perspectives that we use that lead us into wise action, even when we cannot predict or control. So one is the 4 truths. And this is derived from Habermas's ontological realms, where there are 4 different kinds of truth. One is objective truth, evidence-based data. There's normative truth, which is collective wisdom and shared cultural understanding. There's subjective truth, which is one's individual stories of trauma and expectation and hope. And the complex truth says all of the others are true all the time. The process of decision making is to choose the one that's most relevant toward a particular end in a particular moment for a particular decision. So that as an active agent, whether it's an individual or an institution, you're able to parse these out, distinguish, and focus on the ones that are most useful to the ends in mind. The second is adaptive action, a process of iterative decision-making and action, seeing a pattern, understanding it, taking action, collecting data, making sense of that, taking action in iterative cycles. I'll give you an example in a second of that. In fact, of all of these in a particular case that happened in Afghanistan. And then the rules for inquiry. And so how do you, if you are addicted to certainty and control, and certainly I am, how can I control that? How can I shift my pattern of behavior so that even if I'm not curious, I can act like I am till I learn to be? And these are simple rules that we use to shape that perspective. And I'm going to check with you, Jason. How am I doing on time?
I'm so absorbed by your talk. I didn't notice. Just, no problem because we're missing one discussion. So,
great. Okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let me know if I need to stop because I'm really curious about how people are responding to this. And so, inquiry. How do you stand in inquiry? And these rules are practices that we hold ourselves accountable to in our community and believe that they are breakthrough ways to get unstuck and to find innovative solutions that fit for culture. And then the final one is what we call pattern logic. And this is from my research in my doctoral program about the conditions that determine the path and speed and outcomes of self-organizing systems. They're the boundaries that contain it. If they're large, you'll get one pattern. If they're small, you'll get another. Differences that make a difference. If there are very few differences, the system's going to be stable. If there are lots of differences, if there are too many, it'll be chaotic. Someplace in between is just enough variability to be adaptable. And then exchanges, those are the connections among the agents Tight ones lock the system in. Missing ones allow the system to go chaotic. Medium ones are in the middle. And that idea about looking at a situation and a question as a pattern allows you to influence the containers and the differences in the exchanges to shape the pattern. So I'd like to share with you a story in which these features were applied in Afghanistan in the world of training. So there was a fellow who was the husband of an HSD associate who was a retired Army lieutenant general. And he had retired, but he saw what was happening in Afghanistan. He wanted very much to apply these ideas in a military context. And so he re-upped and he went to Afghanistan and became in charge of training for all NATO troops. That was his job. And so he applied these in trying to train in Afghanistan, the NATO troops in Afghanistan. I'm going to stop sharing here while I tell this story. Stop sharing. We can go back to the deck if we want to. So one of the things that he was charged with training on was to help people recognize and defend against IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And they had a checklist and a practical list and a way to know what they look like and a protocol and a place where they'd go to practice. And still, they weren't building the capacity for people to identify and avoid IEDs. He saw it as a pattern. So he sent out a message. He wanted to talk to the 10 best people who could recognize IEDs across Afghanistan. Who were they? He wanted to talk to them. And of course, every team knew who was their best. And so they'd send him to Kent. So Kent would listen to them, and listen to them. And as he was looking at the pattern about what these experts had in common, he realized they had all grown up in dangerous urban settings. They had been members of gangs, youth gangs, street gangs. And they had learned in that patterned environment how to see and understand and respond in the moment to threats in an environment. And they came into the Army with that capacity. And so rather than thinking that he could teach that skill in some kind of an analytical way, controlled way to people, he instead looked for people who had that pattern and invited them and trained them into this skill. And so it was only one of the many ways that he used this intelligence in order to help develop capacity for the soldiers and the companies within the range of Afghanistan. So what were the failures? Everybody knows what they were. Everybody can name them. So what are the patterns within them that we can discern so that we can inform adaptive action in response? And that is the way I believe the future of our engagements, global and domestic, must be. What do we see? So what does it mean? Now, what do we do? And I am dying to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, listening to your presentation, I can understand why we lost the war in Afghanistan. Absolutely. However, I would like to see some connection between these generalizations and reality. The fact is that America went in there with the idea of turning a Muslim society into a liberal democracy. And that was doomed from the start, because they have a totally different culture, different religion, and they simply, no matter how many roads we built them, no matter how many government buildings and water filtration system plants and even mosques, they are not going to look upon us as friends. We wanted to win their hearts and minds, but their hearts and minds are not their hearts and minds are subservient to Islam. And the fact is, the Taliban, in their very rigorous application of Islamic doctrine, the Taliban is much closer to the Islamic population of Afghanistan than we infidels could ever be. And so there was no
Absolutely.
way that we could turn a Muslim society into a liberal democracy. And the reason that we went in there and tried to do that is because none of our civilian and military leaders had ever studied the doctrines of Islam, which in fact occupy the hearts and minds of the population that we were trying to change. So it seems to me we need to look at it from this point of view, that we had no idea of the culture and religion which determined their hearts and minds. The only difference between the Taliban and the rest of the population in Afghanistan, with the exception of the elite in Kabul, the only difference was that the Taliban wanted a stricter application of Sharia law than the rest of the country did. Remember, the constitution of our Afghanistan, the name of the country, by the way, was the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan that we put in. And in their constitution, it says that they will follow Sharia law as the basis for all legislation. That's our Afghanistan. The Taliban want the same thing, only more of it.
Mm. Well, I totally agree with you. I think that is absolutely true. And I'm not sure how useful that perspective is. It is absolutely true. But what we're looking for, what I'm looking for, is an understanding that is also useful. And how can we slice this in a way that it can inform wise action? And I have to disagree with you on one item. In the War College, people study Islam. There's no question about it. They have studied Islam. At least the senior leadership and those who are doing strategy across the US military have studied Islam. The problem is that they have studied it through their Western Christian or Jewish perspective and lens, and see it therefore distorted. So they've studied it a lot, but because their lens is so distorted, the more they study it, the worse it gets. So I think the way that they see it, not that they don't see, they see it a lot. They just see it in a distorted way. I agree with you 100%. And it's particularly poignant, I think, Carl, because we're seeing the same patterns emerge in domestic policy with Christian fundamentalists. And so there are ways in which we're seeing the same kinds of patterns here, or at least some are saying that. So I agree with you 100%. And how can we see it in a way that we can do something? What would you suggest if, given what you're saying is true, what's a path of action that you think might be useful?
We should never have tried to reform their society. After kicking out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the beginning, which was our purpose, because we didn't want Al-Qaeda to indulge in their international terrorism. After kicking them out, we should have simply not tried to reform their society, but simply done what is in our American and Western interest, which is to prevent them from engaging in international terrorism. That was it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's wonderful because it sounds like that's going to be Biden's strategy going forward. At least that's what he is saying he wants to do with international relations going forward. So from your lips to God's ears, as we say.
I use that expression all the time.
It's a good one, isn't it? Right.